Always. Sunset on 3rd Street movie review. So this is a Japanese movie I'm reviewing. This movie, I forget exactly when it came out, kind of mid-aughts, like 2005, 2006. It was a huge hit in Japan at the time. I ended up catching it on DVD. There was a sequel that I haven't actually seen, but this is the first movie. So this movie is about Tokyo in 1958. And it's one of those movies that's just chock full of nostalgia. Like, remember this, remember this, remember this. So it's aimed at kind of Japanese people who are maybe old enough to remember it. But it's also aimed at a younger crowd, you know, kind of people, well, like myself. Well, I'm not Japanese, but Japanese people who kind of have this image of like what the 1950s was like because they heard about it from their parents but kind of never lived through it. You know what I mean. We've got the same type of movies here in America as well. Now, one of the difficulties in filming a movie like this is Tokyo has just completely transformed its landscape since the 1950s. It looks nothing today like it did in 1958. So, most of the background for this movie is done completely with CGI. And they pull it off. I guess the technology is getting to the point where you can really pull this off, because I could not tell what was computer CGI and what was the studio backstage. It just looks good. Now, the film takes place in Tokyo, which is one of the biggest cities in the world. But oddly enough, the story in this movie has kind of a small town feel. Everyone on the block knows everyone else and is involved in each other's lives. The shopkeepers know the customers on a first-name basis. And in the local bar, everyone knows your name and your whole history. At times it felt like I was watching Our Town, you know, that popular play about a small town. Not a movie based on Tokyo, like the largest megapolis in the world, or one of them. But I wonder, first of all, I guess the movie is obviously not about all of Tokyo, but just like this particular block. So maybe, you know, people, I guess it's the same in New York, right? People have their blocks in New York where everybody knows each other. The other thing that occurred to me is maybe people really did know their neighbors back in the 1950s. You know, like before television made everybody a shut-in in their own house. You know, back in those days, everybody was out and about on the block and everybody knew each other. That, or maybe it's just a movie. I don't know. Anyways, the movie is about everyone kind of on the block. So as such, it follows several different interconnected stories. There's an auto repairman who dreams of making it big. There's a girl from the countryside who comes to Tokyo for her first job. There's a lonely doctor who lost his wife and daughter during the war. There's a hack writer who is frustrated because of his literary ambitions are not kind of getting off the ground. And through this kind of rather convoluted, weird plot, he ends up being stuck with this kid that he has to take care of. And then all these kind of plot threads kind of intersect with each other. Like, you know how these movies work. Throughout the movie, there's a lot of old 1950s Japanese songs playing in the background of this movie, which I really enjoyed. I actually, during my time in Japan, I got really into Japanese oldies. So I actually would listen to a lot of these old songs from the 1950s and the 1960s in Japan. So while I was watching the movie, I was like, oh, I know that song. I know that song. I know, that's just me. I'm really into Japanese oldies. The other interesting thing throughout the movie is a touch on a lot of kind of the landmark cultural events in the 1950s. So, like the first time somebody on the block gets a TV and all the excitement that it causes to have like, a house with a TV on it. The first time somebody tastes Coca-Cola. The first refrigerator. It's a reminder actually of how much Japan has changed. Everywhere has changed since the 1950s. The United States has undergone massive changes since the 1950s. But Japan, much more so than the United States. For one thing, Japan was essentially a third world country in the 1950s. So to have that massive economic transformation. And also all the huge Western influence that came into Japan since the 1950s. So, you can imagine an elderly Japanese person, how much change they've seen in their lifetime. It's really almost kind of mind-blowing to think about it. Okay, now the acting in this movie. If you're at all familiar with Japanese cinema, you know that there's kind of more of a style of overacting than there is kind of in the American movies. And that does kind of come through to this movie. It annoyed me a bit, but that's just the style of a lot of Japanese films. The director, however, can be subtle when he wants to. And there are some kind of good, kind of subtle humor payoff moments that I thought were really clever in this movie. The other thing that Japanese dramas can be quite famous for, especially the domestic Japanese dramas, like, not the ones that kind of make it big abroad, but kind of the ones that are quite popular domestically inside of Japan for Japanese audiences, are tear-jerking dramas. These are kind of so popular in Japan. And this is a real tear-jerker. So the first kind of hour is just kind of all set up, kind of all setting up these plot lines. And then the second hour is just one gut-wrenching, tear-jerking scene after another. And it's got this soundtrack, which consists of like a soft piano and a violin chorus, which kind of starts up slowly and then gets kind of louder and louder as you crescendo to the emotional moment. And then it just kind of fades away, and then they kind of start up in the next scene again. I hated it. Well, kind of. To be fair, by the second half, the first half of the movie was really well done. So by the second half, I was invested enough in these characters that it did get me. I admit to getting teary-eyed and going, look away, I'm not crying, there's just something in my eye. It did get me. But I don't know what the purpose of these movies are. Why? Maybe this is just a personality thing, or I don't like movies that just have these tear-jerking scenes just for the sake of having tear-jerking scenes. And maybe that's just, because I like stupid action movies instead. I don't know. But, if there's a point to it, if it's a movie about apartheid or, injustice or something like that, then sure, bring on the emotions. But if it's just this kind of sappy drama, they got me. I did kind of get teary-eyed watching it. But I really don't, once it was over, I didn't see what the point of that was. Now, this movie kind of ends on a bit of a cliffhanger with all these plot threads, or most of them, unresolved. I guess the sequel is where these plot threads are going to be resolved. I have actually, to this day, never bothered to go out and see the sequel. But, yeah, maybe I will someday.